Welcome to another episode of the Everyday Defender podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goosen, and I'm joined once again by my friend from the Netherlands, Koos.
Hey, Chris. Good morning. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. I've had some feedback, actually. People have been giving me a hard time because I don't introduce you properly, apparently.
Really?
Yeah. So what? Because I don't, I pronounce my surname as Goosen, right? So, but I know you're not Goosens. You have a unique pronunciation to your surname.
Give it a try, Chris. Let's hear it.
Let's see. Goosens.
Goosens. That's very good. Very nice.
Yeah. So I think what you should do is just do it once for everyone, so everyone knows your full name here, and then I won't get in trouble for not introducing you properly anymore.
Well, you introduced me just fine, Chris. But yeah, indeed, both my first and my last name in English would get an oo sound to it, right? Like Koos, Goosens, people say. But in the Netherlands we say Koos, Goosens, and the G is a hard G. You have to really put your throat in it.
Yeah, that's right. Very European. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a couple of really interesting things, actually. I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive into email authentication and email security. This actually will be part one of a two-parter. When I first started this, it was going to be all one part. But as I started digging into it, I realized that, there's actually a lot to cover. And so I figured we'd split part two into the next episode. So something to look forward to for next time. And Koos, tell us what you have for us.
I want to talk about Entra ID Entitlement Management, also known as access packages.
Very nice.
Started using it in the company I work for, and it actually was under my radar for a long while, and it's one of the Entra ID governance features. But we'll go into more detail on that.
It's it's super convenient stuff. I recently onboarded with a new company, and we use access packages. Makes just getting access to stuff so much easier, right? By doing it. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say about it. But yeah, first let's sort of jump into sort of the email security rabbit hole, right? I've called it SPF, DMARC, and all the acronyms, because once you start digging into this, there really are so many different acronyms. I'm going to do my best to sort of break some of the stuff down. A lot of the stuff is probably going to be familiar with the folks who work in the email space. But what I find is when I work with customers and sort of do security assessments of their environments, I always look at email security. And by that, I mean, obviously you look at what their inbound email spam and malware filtering configuration is. But I also look at their, I guess what I would call email authentication configuration, right? Which it's not a Microsoft specific thing. It's more of a set of protocols. And I never find these things to be optimized. There's always something that can be improved or something that can be done better, because it's difficult, right? And just the nature of email, things change, organizations change. So I thought, it'd be a really good time for us to kind of go through these things. I have some just little tips to kind of help you optimize your environment with these things. And of course, as with everything we talk about, it's not sit and forget, right? This is really something you kind of want to be looking at, every now and then. So,
and I'm looking forward to learn here as well, Chris, because it's been quite some while when I did my last email migration to Office 365 back in the day, and I created SPF records back then, but the DKIM and DMARC weren't really in the picture back then, I believe. So I'm looking forward to learn from that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that a lot of the stuff when you set up a tenant, Microsoft give you a very generic record, which you need as a very sort of bare minimum, but it doesn't, it's not specific or customized or optimized for your environment, right? So when we talk about email authentication, we're talking about, as I said, it's standards that really kind of help identify and prevent spoofing. The three main ones we're going to cover today, I'm going to talk about SPF. Everyone calls it SPF. So Sender Policy Framework, which, as you alluded, has been around for quite a long time. Really what this does is it helps specify the source servers that are authorized to send on behalf of a domain. So, if you're receiving an email from, abc.com, your SPF record is what essentially says, look, the server that has sent you that is allowed to send on behalf of abc.com, right? We're going to talk about DKIM or DKIM, which is Domain Keys Identified Mail. And that's really just a way to digitally sign a message. to make sure that it hasn't really been altered at all in transit. And then the thing that kind of ties all of these things together, DMARC, right, which is domain-based messaging authentication, reporting, and conformance. It's a big mouthful, so DMARC really is what we all call it. And quite frankly, if I didn't have it written down in front of me, I probably wouldn't have remembered what it stands for. So no issue if you don't. DMARC, that's the one you want to know. And really, what DMARC is it's a policy that says or specifies the action to take when a message fails SPF or DKIM, right? And then it also provides some information as to where to send the reports on, DMARC results, DMARC reporting. So I don't really want to dig into, I'm not going to dive too deep into the very, very specifics, I'm going to kind of keep it a little bit surface level, but we'll run through some things. And, I think the important thing to understand here, though, is that we're talking about outbound email authentication protocols, right? So you're validating your outbound messages. And the theory here is that if everyone validates that the email they send is legit and that they are the only one allowed to send email on their behalf, it becomes a lot easier to identify spammers, because if you receive something and it didn't come from a verified or validated sender, well, then you can junk it safely without losing anything important. Obviously, a lot easier said than done, but that's kind of where we go. So if we jump into SPF, what SPF does is it actually validates that the mail from header on the message is the sender that is sending the mail from header is actually valid and legitimate for that domain, right? So technically, if we dig into the very specifics of the RFC, we're talking about the RFC 5321 mail from header. And if you look at an email, if you've ever looked at a message header analyzer or anything, you'll know that an email has two fields or headers that can dictate the from address. And SPF deals with the mail from one specifically, right? And like I said, it's there to make sure that the sender in that header is actually authorized to send on behalf of the domain. And SPF, it's a text record. You will find it in public DNS. It's very easy to look it up for any domain. And usually it starts with the string v equals SPF1, and then it has a bunch of stuff behind it, right? And there are a ton of SPF record creators and generators and things like that online. Typically, like I said, when you add a new domain to M365, what it does is it will give you a very sort of base SPF record, which is the sort of bare minimum that you need to add that domain to your environment. And that will include the specific servers that Microsoft used to send your email outbound to make sure that you're validating those correctly, right? It doesn't take into account other systems that you may have. So you may have on-premises relay servers that still send email on your behalf. A lot of organizations have these relays that send, for example, multifunction printers and things like that to email those out. You may be using a third party for payroll or any number of other services, right? Salesforce, for example, things like that you may be using to send email on your behalf. And you need to include those servers in your SPF record to make sure they function correctly. So important, I think, to understand that, one, the record or the base record that Microsoft gives you, it's just that, it's a base record, right? So you have to take into account all of the services that you use and build them into your SPF correctly. We'll talk a little bit later about DMARC, and DMARC is a good way to help you actually catch and identify services that maybe are sending on your behalf that are not in your SPF record through the DMARC reporting. And if you pay attention to that stuff, then you can always come back later on and amend your record accordingly. It happens a lot. Because what happens is your marketing department goes out and buys some marketing automation tool. They don't consult.
Or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. And they don't consult IT about it. And so SPFs never get updated. They're trying to send out mail blasts and all sorts of things to their customers. And of course, mail delivery issues occur, right? And so you can catch those things through your DMARC reporting, which is why that stuff's so important. It's SPF at its sort of core is actually pretty simple. If you're in a complicated environment that has tons of email flowing from different services, it can get a little tricky when you start going above sort of 10 DNS lookups in the record, right? And a little bit about what we call SPF cleanup or flattening in the next episode. But for your basic SPF records, some tips that you want to kind of think about here is, one, you want to use what we call a hard fail. So with SPF, you can tell what to do with a server that is not on your list by what the record appends with. So, for example, if you have a tilde all that says, if a server is not authorized to send as me, well, it's a soft fail. And really, soft fails are not really worth anything, right?
It defeats the whole purpose of SPF, right?
It does. And you will not believe how often I come across domains that are set to soft fail. The record itself is perfect. It has everything it needs in it, but then it has a soft fail. Problematic, because really it's not worth it. Again, Microsoft used to do that for the base, like the standard records they provide when you add a domain to M365. I don't know if they still do a soft fail, but they certainly used to do soft fails. And so you used to find this all the time, that someone does a migration or whatever, they grab the default record, they add a couple of other things. It's a soft fail, but they add it in there, and then they just never look at it again, because, why would you? Well, you kind of need to revisit it. So I would say you always want to use a hard fail, which is essentially a dash all, which indicates a hard fail. At least then you know for sure, if something is not included in your SPF record, not authorized, that message is not going to get accepted by a third-party server. Another tip is you want to align your SPF in your DMARC, right? And again, we'll talk about DMARC, but ultimately what you want is you want an SPF to hard fail. You want your DMARC to be a reject. And we'll talk about DMARC policies in a little bit, but align those. You don't want one to be more restrictive or less restrictive than the other one. This might sound pretty obvious, but it isn't to a lot of organizations. You want to monitor your SPF records. You want to clean them up regularly. Keep checking them. If you've got Salesforce in there today, well, when you go and move away from Salesforce and start using Dynamics, the Salesforce record in your SPF is not going to clean itself up automatically, right? So you want to have some sort of process, every 6 months, every 3 months, once a quarter, once a year, whatever it is that works for your organization. You want to have a process whereby you revisit your SPF records and you make sure that the services that are listed in there are still legitimate for your business and still being used. And that, goes back to records keeping within your business, within your organization, understanding who the owner of services are, things like that. Again, not a big deal if you're a small enough organization, but once you start growing, it can become a little bit tricky. And I talked about limiting your records to 10 DNS lookups. Just bear in mind, right, the more you add in there, you may eventually start having issues with your SPF if you just keep piling things on. There are some techniques that we can use to kind of keep those slimmed down, and we'll talk about that in the next episode.
There is no technical limit, right, to the record, to the amount of DNS lookups you can add to them.
No, I think that eventually it will. You will get an error, like when. And I'm not sure what happens to the actual message. That's a good point. Like if your record has more in it than what can be looked up, I think you will eventually have an error with that. The record will just fail.
And I can imagine no receiving email server would be happy to do all those DNS lookups, right? That's
right. So you want to kind of keep it to 10. There is a limit. I'm not sure what it is offhand. Okay. I think 10 is typically the
is also already quite a lot.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so onto DKIM, or DKIM as some folks call it, right? So what DKIM does is essentially, DKIM looks at the other of two from headers in the message, right? So we're talking about the from header itself. So RFC 5322.from is the header name, and it uses keys to make sure, so private and public keys to make sure that that message and that header has not been altered during transport, right? So it'll get the public key from a DNS record, and the message itself obviously then is sent. When it is sent, it includes a key, so those keys can get compared, and it will validate that there's been no changes during transport. It's pretty easy to configure DKIM. It's not a very difficult thing to do, really, in M365, and depending on your service, it may vary a little bit, but the basic structure is the same. In M365, you're going to create two CNAME records. Typically selector 1 and selector 2, and they have sort of an underscore domain key sort of designation, and you're going to point those to what Microsoft tell you to point them to. and then you're going to go into the domain settings, and you're going to enable domain signing or domain keys or DKIM, whichever the user interface says for you. And that's pretty much it. That's the thing. So if it's that easy, why are we even talking about it, right? Well, one, it's not done by default on your custom domains. So if you add in domain.com, it's not automatically going to do it for you. So you are going to have to take the action to go and actually do that in that particular domain. So there's that piece. The other part of it is you actually have to rotate these keys. And this is something that almost no one ever does, right? Is you want to rotate those keys probably every 3 to 6 months. You want to sort of go in there and rotate the keys. And you can actually do that. There's a PowerShell command for it, for rotating DKIM keys. You could automate this task even if you really wanted to. You didn't have to go and do it manually, but it's a good idea to do it sort of every 3 to 6 months, at most every 6 months. Rotate those keys so that they, you're not keeping the same key for too long.
So what is needed during the rotation process, Chris? Because I would think, why isn't Microsoft automatically rotating it for us?
Well, that's a good question. I actually don't know why they don't automatically rotate it. Maybe because of sort of downstream implications or something like that. Microsoft are very careful, I guess, with these types of things because they don't know what else they could break, right? Obviously, they only have visibility of M365 and they don't have things visibility of anything beyond that. The other thing that I would say that you want to consider if you're implementing this is that if you have other services that also send email on your behalf, you want to enable DKIM in those services as well. Otherwise, you're only going to be sending signed email from M365. And when Salesforce or anything else sends email on your behalf, they're not going to be sending that as a signed email. Ideally, I like to make sure that all my mail routes through the same place, right? You want to have things route through in and out of the same place if you can. That way you can apply all the same policies and the same signing keys and all that type of stuff to it. That's not always possible, I guess, depending on what your scenario is. And you may be using something like Mimecast or Proofpoint or the like. They'll also support DKIM, but you on that outbound, you might want to go and enable it there, right, instead. So I don't think you want to be necessarily enabling signing in M365 and then also in Mimecast, right, for example, right? So you want to consider what your mail routing sort of configuration looks like, and you want to go and enable this stuff, at the place where it is going to outbound to the internet. So now, SPF, DKIM, those are pretty self-explanatory. And the one that I always say this sort of wraps them all together or ties them all together is DMARC, which is essentially, as I said before, it's a way to sort of tell receiving servers how to handle messages that fail one of these two things, right? So if you're receiving an email from me and that email does not have a valid SPF entry, what do you do with that email? And similarly, if it's not signed, what do you do with that email? So we look for two things. It's alignment to SPF and DKIM. And that's essentially what your DMARC record does and what it instructs. And it will actually look at, you have multiple options there for what you do with it, right? So you can obviously have a policy, a DMARC policy that, your policy is defined by P equals in your record. So you'll have a DMARC text record, similar to an SPF. It starts with V equals DMARC 1. And you'll have a string of things in there to tell what the record does. And then you would have a P equals, which is essentially what instructs the policy. You could have a P equals none, which obviously means the record's doing nothing, or at least it's not being applied. Or you could have P equals reject, which is really what you want, which is the sort of hard fail, if you will, in the SPF world, where if a message fails to align one of those two things, you want to reject the message. And then again, you have P equals quarantine, which again, kind of like a soft fail in SPF, not really worth much. My advice is to always be on P equals reject, unless you're implementing this, of course, right? You can't go from having no DMARC to P equals reject. That's not a good idea. You're likely to lose email there. So what you want to do is you want to sort of, when you're implementing this, actually, you want to do this over time. When I work with my customers, usually we implement this over a 4-week period. So we'll start with a new record that says P equals none. what that does is it's essentially a monitoring for us, right? We give it an RUF and an RUA endpoint, which is essentially our forensic reporting and our aggregate reporting endpoints, where we receive the reports. It takes about a week to start receiving reports anyway. So the longer you can do this, the more reports you can get, and obviously the more data you can gather about what's happening with your email traffic. But usually 4 weeks is a good period of time. You get a nice number of reports that you can take a look at. Well, we've had this set to none. What do our reports look like? Are we rejecting email from Salesforce as an example? I can pick on them just because it's easy. We want to actually be sending from Salesforce, but maybe we don't have the correct Salesforce entries in our SPF, or the stuff is not being signed correctly. So it would be rejected if we had a P equals reject. Now we have that data in our report. We can go and update our SPF. We can go and make changes to DKIM if we have to, before we come back and tighten the screws again to firm it down. Now, I once did this for a customer with 50 domains. So we went through this process of 50 domains, DMARC, P equals none, gathered information for 4 to 6 weeks on what was going on, took all of that information, had to comb through it all, figure out what the issues were, what tweaks needed to be made the tweaks, came back again. Then we set it to P equals quarantine, see what, where we are again. I think there's very little value going from none to quarantine to reject. If you go from none, you can keep it on for another 4 weeks if you want to make sure. And then from there, you can go to reject. I think that's a matter of preference, but you kind of want to gather that data when you're just implementing this, right?
Yeah. What's your experience, Chris, with the larger organizations you worked for in the past? Is this on their agenda most of the times, or do you really have to point it out to them?
No, look, I think a lot of orgs are kind of coming around to this pretty now. I think 2024 was a big year for DMARC, especially because providers like Google, if you don't have a DMARC record, they're not going to receive email from you anymore, right? Like they just reject it. So that sort of has forced adoption, I think, a lot more. Lots of providers have started to do that. So it's definitely on the agenda. Yeah. How well people and folks keep it up to date, that again is an issue, right? And really the key to monitoring and keeping this up to date is how you deal with the reporting. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But so from a sort of tips perspective, like I said, you want to always have P equals reject. In M365, you want to have a DMARC policy for your routing domain, right? Your Moira domain, which is that .onmicrosoft.com domain that you get when you create a tenant. Well, by default, that may not have a DMARC record. And if you're not going to be sending any email from that record, from that domain, well, why not just put a DMARC record on there that just blocks all mail from being received, right? So that way, if someone tries to spoof or tries to do something funky with that domain, you've got a little bit of a safeguard there. So that would be a tip there, is look at your as they call it, the Moira domain. I just like to call it my routing domain because that makes more sense, but that's something to look at. From a monitoring perspective, as I said, DMARC reports are really important, right? One of the benefits of DMARC is that you get some really good insights into your reports. Now, what I often see happen is folks set this up. They point their RUA and the RUF, which is the two types of reports you can get, to a shared mailbox or a M365 group sitting somewhere, and they just leave it, and they just never look at it again. And every week you're going to get like a bunch of reports from all of the email providers into there, but the reports are in XML. They're not really human readable. I mean, you can pass them if you're super geeky, but it's not the easiest of thing to go and just like look through that, make the use of that information, right? So what you want to look at is a DMARC reporting service that can actually help you with this. And I think it's a really good idea. It helps you figure out if your domains are being abused, right? If folks are trying to spoof you, you're going to pick that up in your DMARC reports, and you can do something about it, right? You can make sure that those legitimate emails are actually being delivered. So your Salesforce emails, your MailChimp emails. If someone in accounting goes and signs up for a service and starts trying to send email, well, you're going to pick that up in those reports, and you can do something about making sure that they get delivered. And it's going to protect your brand, your reputation, all that type of stuff by knowing what's happening with your email. So have a look at these services. There are a bunch of them available. There are some free ones. They give you very, very basic information. The basic information may be good enough for you. And then there are some, like, they start off with a very sort of tiered pricing, right? There are some of them that charge per domain, stuff like that. There are so many. I don't even want to start naming names of some of these services because there are a lot of them around. Some of them are very expensive and probably not worth your while if you are a smaller organization. If reputation and that sort of brand reputation is super important to you, hey, you might want to splash up. But I think most organizations can kind of find a service that sort of fits within the budget that they have. The important thing is look at what's around and do something. You can roll your own too. I had the customer that I talked about that we did this with 50 domains. They actually use Splunk. There are some reports and stuff available for Splunk, and we used a connector for Splunk that grabbed the data out of a mailbox. And their guys kind of built some really cool dashboards on email. And they're a B2C sort of consumer facing brand, right? So for them, understanding their outbound email stuff was really important because they were getting, folks were bad actors were trying to spoof their brand names all the time and to try and scam their customers. So really important for them to understand this, right? So take a look at it. There's some other open source projects available that you can sort of roll your own reporting service depending on your emails and what you're doing. Some of them are easier to set up than others. A lot of them use the Elk stack, which is kind of nice. I've had some good success with some of those with projects with customers where we wanted to build some dashboards and stuff. So take a look at it. If you're not sure about any of the stuff, right? If you're sitting here and you're going, I don't even know what my authentication protocols look like today. Well, guess what? There's this really cool site called learndmark.com. When you visit learndmark.com, it generates a unique address for you, and you send an email to that address. Just send it from your own mailbox to that address, blank email, it doesn't matter. And when your email gets received by them, they will automatically do all of these lookups and checks for you, and they will give you a really cool report. It's kind of like it's almost like a game. I really think it's a cool service. Give you a really cool report on where you sit within, compliance to SPF and DMARC, DKIM, things like that. Whether you have records, whether you need to make changes to records, things like that. They do such a really good job of that. So I would definitely encourage you to kind of get on top of these things. There are some great resources out there to help you build records properly. And sort of test for this stuff to make sure that your deliverability of your email is good, and it's a really good idea. In our next episode, what I will do is I'm gonna jump into some other things that kind of help with email security. So we'll look at SPF cleanup and flattening for those folks who have a large number of includes or things that they need to include in their in their SPF. How do we keep those records lean and efficient? And then I want to look into something called Authenticated Receive Chain, or ARC, and MTA-STS, which is Mail Transfer Agent Strict Transfer Security. And those are some of the newer technologies that have come to market. I think, if I'm not mistaken, ARC is officially supported now in Exchange Online M365 since October. And these are some newer things, and a lot of these use keys and encryption and DNS and stuff. So we'll dive deeper into some of those, and obviously, if anyone has any questions about any of the ones I've just covered, feel free to let us know, and we'll try and address those for you.
Yeah, it's too bad, Chris. We have so much technology to keep our email safe from point A to B, and we still haven't figured out how we can prevent the spammers from registering randomstring.com and send emails on your behalf that way, right?
Yeah, it's a real pain, right? I think if we all just do the basics right, then we are so much better off with a lot of the stuff. Everyone thinks that they always have to focus on the inbound stuff and how they, what their spam policies and how many layers of filtering they have and all of that. And very often they just forget about the outbound stuff. So
yeah. I'm also surprised now that I learned about DKIM, DMARC, that still a lot of legitimate emails in my Gmail still end up in my spam folder. You would assume if everything's set up properly, you could assume that the email is safe, right? If everything's set up.
Yeah, you're right. It's a big problem. Like I said, there's some really cool and actually, there's one of the local here in Australia's sort of security analyst guys has a really cool PowerShell script. I forgot to put it in any of the show notes. I might try and track it down and put it in.
I actually, next time when you continue on part 2.
That's right. That'll be good for part 2. It's a script that I use today when I do analysis for customers, because you feed the script a list of a text file with all your domain names in it, and it will go and generate a really nice report for you on what the SPF record is, what the DMARC record is, what the DKIM record is. You can look all the stuff up manually, obviously, but it's nice to have a script just like pump it out into a spreadsheet for you. So,
yeah, good stuff.
Awesome. Tell us about Entra ID Entitlement Management.
Yes, I will. It was actually something I needed to investigate and look into recently for my own employer, and I thought, why isn't this used more often? Well, I didn't saw it used that much at customers, to be honest. We all know that when people need access to something, if it's a mailbox, an application, a SharePoint site, whatever, they have to go through some kind of change process, and somebody needs to make them a member of a group, perhaps. And with entitlement management, you can create access packages and automate a lot of that stuff. So you were already familiar with it, I hear. But for the people listening, they might not, just as I wasn't a couple of months ago. And what's great, you can actually define access packages, defining certain access, like a group membership or Teams access, and people can request that access package. And based on how the access package is configured, it will go through an optional approval step, for example. People get granted into the group. And what's also great, if people, for example, when they start at your company, they can request access packages, for example, get access to Salesforce, since this is your favorite application, Chris. But also, if they move to a different role in the future, with access reviews tied to the access package, you could say, okay, well, Chris does no longer need access to Salesforce any longer. He now has a different job inside the company. So we strip that access, and the access package gets unassigned from your account. And I think, especially with larger organizations, it can make things a lot easier. Well, and you had some good experience as a new employee recently, because normally you wouldn't even know how to get access to a certain application, right? You ask around, you email a couple of people, you open up a service request with Service Desk or something like that. And now you can just go to myaccess.microsoft.com and you see all the access packages which are available to you, and then you can just request them that way.
It's super easy, right? I think like a really good scenario, a really good use case that I've seen used internally is access to Copilot, because we know Copilot licensing can be a little bit expensive, right? And so if a user doesn't know or want Copilot, why just give them a license? Instead, make it available to them as an access package. If they want Copilot, they can find the access package, request access to it, and then obviously you follow the workflow of putting them in a group. The group-based licensing kicks in, and it goes off and assigns a license. So very, very convenient.
Yeah, so you're right. You can the permissions you can grant people access to are Entra ID security groups, Microsoft 365 groups, and teams. So you can also use groups for licenses, like you say. You can also assign enterprise application access, so your SaaS application, like Salesforce, for example, or your custom integrated applications for which you have set up a federated SSO, for example, but also SharePoint online sites. What was great, what I was actually surprised by, that you can also use this for people outside your organization, and this is how I use it now at my employer, to get access to our customers. So when you make an access package and you describe that it is available to people outside your organization, you can even scope it on specific organizations so that not the entire world can access it, right? What it actually does, when somebody outside the organization requests it, automatically a guest account is created as well. So you are invited into that organization. And once you no longer need the access package anymore, the guest account is disabled and cleaned up automatically as well. So think about it. You had to do this all manually before, right? Yeah. And if you're starting to collaborate with an external party, how would you know which people from the external organization you need to invite, right? So just set up an access package, share the link with the company, and they can just click it and request access.
That's very cool. And then presumably because you've got a guest account, your conditional access and all of those great things that you have in Entra will apply to that as well. So you can have that layer of security wrapped around it as well.
Yeah, that's true. And the scenario we used it for at my employer is we run a managed detection and response service. So we have a lot of security analysts needing access to our customers to do incident response on all the Microsoft security products. And I actually created a PowerShell script which can set up all the access packages for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 analysts. The customer just needs to run that one time. The access packages are created, and then new analysts that start working at our company can request access that way. And what we actually also did, because it was quite a hassle when a security analyst uses MFA, obviously, we use phishing resistant MFA as well. So FIDO2 keys most likely. But they had to repeat their MFA every time they switch to customer, right? Because the customer again has their own MFA policies. And but you can also allow, for example, a trusted organization to trust the MFA claim. So that way, and this was actually part of our onboarding, so that we know when somebody is already authenticated to Entra ID with a phishing resistant MFA methods, the highest MFA strength possible, then you could assume the MFA is safe and there's no added value to do that again, right? You trust the claim and you have a sort of single sign-on experience.
Very nice. Yeah.
One thing I do really hope they add in the future within an access package, you can, like I said, you can assign groups, for example. You can make people who get the access package assigned a member of the group or the owner of the group. So you can also delegate those permissions, but you're not able to apply eligible permissions to the group. So I wanted to have privileged identity management added to privileged permissions, right? So, and I don't want to assign, let's say, global reader or security administrator straight from an access package. I want a PIM in between as well. So what I now had to do is made an additional group, assign that to the access package, so people get into that group when the access package is applied or assigned, I should say. And that group is actually part of a scope of another PIM-enabled group. So you have an extra step in between. So it would be nice if Microsoft adds an option to that pull-down menu member owner eligible or something. That would be great. Then the setup would even be more streamlined.
Hey, maybe we could give Meryl some feedback. Maybe Meryl's listening to this and we say, hey, Meryl, there's a great scenario for you, Meryl. We love you, Meryl, and there's a great scenario for you to take for consideration for us.
Yeah, I must admit I have discussed it with a couple of people, and they were aware of it, but I'm not sure if they will do anything about it.
Fair enough.
So as I mentioned in the start, entitlement management is actually part of Entra ID governance. And I want to stay away from licensing hell as much as possible in this podcast because it's not my specialty. But I did some research before this episode. Entra ID governance is actually an additional license or an additional group of features with a separate license. So before, when you bought an E5 license, you were like, okay, now I have everything, right? You have all the security stuff. You have Entra ID, Premium P2. You have all the fancy features. Well, now you're wrong because Entra ID governance is yet an additional feature, but not for access packages and entitlement management. So that's a good news. So Entra ID governance has a lot of different stuff, and which might not be licensed by default with P2, but you can use access packages. So rest assured that you don't need to buy licenses first.
Very good. I was just going to ask you about licensing, so I'm glad you kind of covered that one off for us. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, there are all kinds of step-up licenses for Entra ID governance from P1 and P2, and all kinds of ways to buy into that. Maybe I should pay more attention to Entra ID governance in a future episode. I'm not sure. I'm actually surprised, by the way, that I'm talking so much about Entra ID the last couple of episodes, because I'm actually more into Sentinel and Defender. But the last couple of months were a lot of. I put a lot of effort in Entra ID with passkeys and access packages. So
there's a lot. There's a lot there. Entra has so much, right?
Yeah.
There's so much to it, and especially when you start looking at some of these add-on SKUs, there's a lot of functionality, a lot of capability there. So I'm not surprised that once you start kind of digging into it, it opens itself up to quite a lot. So, very cool.
Entra is not only identity any longer as well. You now also have with private access, you have VPN solutions and everything. But also, we might need to return to that in a future episode.
That's right. Lots to it. So
yes,
very good.
So before I guess we want to round off with our community project.
Yeah, go ahead. Tell the folks what you've been working on.
Yeah, this is kind of a shameless plug, to be honest. But since it's community, I think it's allowed, right?
Of course.
So we already had black hat and blue hat, but now in March we also have yellow hat. And this is actually a term that was coined by somebody from Microsoft ILDC. I was actually looking up his name, Dan Mickelson, sorry. He actually came up with yellow hat during the MVP summit in 2019. I'm not sure if you were there, Chris.
I was there, but I don't remember the.
You weren't in security back then.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so he led a 1-day yellow hat hackathon, and the idea was to perhaps branch out to a bigger event, and then COVID hit and it never came to fruition. So that's why me and a couple of other fellow security MVPs decided to pick up that idea and organize the event. I hope Dan will be there as well. So it's an online event and in person. So we're going to stream all the sessions, and these are all 100% Microsoft security sessions, deep dive, level 400 plus. So we have a lot of nice people from Microsoft, both Israel and Redmond, coming to Amsterdam as well to speak during the event. Again, we're going to live stream it between 3 p.m. and 9 p.m. Central European time. So you have to go to yellowhat.live and you can see the schedule, and it will automatically adjust to your time zone to see what your local times will be. You can register for a live stream access. So I guess you should do that right now. And if you're in the Netherlands or around, you can also buy a few remaining in-person VIP tickets to be part of it. We're hosting it at Microsoft HQ in Amsterdam. They will be hosting it for us with lunch and drinks and snacks and whatnot. And it's also an opportunity to meet and greet those nice people from Microsoft as well.
Very cool. I think that's going to be something to look forward to. I just had a look at the time zones here, and of course Sydney has the best time zone. It's 1 a.m. 1 a.m. to 8 a.m.
We deliberately set a time zone in the afternoon, evening, so it would be both for the US in the morning, and also people from Israel or a little bit later can still join. But sorry, maybe we should do a yellow hat Australia someday.
Hey, look, if that means you guys get to travel over here, you should definitely look at that. But no, I think that's awesome. I think I will definitely register and see what sort of things I can get out of it.
So March 6th.
March 6th, perfect. Very, very good. We'll share information about this, in the show notes for this, for anyone who's listening and may have forgotten the link or anything. But yellowhat.live is the URL. We'll add it to the show notes. Very nice. Thank you. Well, I think with that we could wrap up another episode. Really appreciate you folks listening and or watching. I guess if you are watching this on YouTube, thank you very much. Feel free to like and subscribe, and
follow
us on your favorite platform. Hey, and until next time, Koos and I are saying goodbye. We'll see you next month.
See you later. Bye bye.